As I said, I'm going to talk mostly about a recent project that we've had, the organisation of provision to support inclusive education. And in 2011, all our member countries decided that this was a priority and something they wanted the agency to look at. And we looked at this question: how are systems of provision organised to meet the needs of learners identified as having disabilities? And that's a huge area, so to try and define it more carefully, we looked at the United Nations Convention definition of disability, and we focused on learners in compulsory education. We looked at information from all our countries. Actually, 25 of our member countries took part in this project. So we sent a questionnaire and analysed information from 25 countries and looked at examples of practice from different countries. We looked at our recent agency work, we did a literature review of recent research literature, and then we selected 5 examples to look at in much more detail. Some are in Sweden, Flensburg in Germany, Ljubljana in Slovenia, Valletta, Malta, and Vienna in Austria. And my colleague Per Skuggen will be talking a little bit more about 2 of those examples in particular. So we did some in-depth studies of these examples and visits to the site, and then we had follow-up seminars to explore some of the issues that were raised by those visits. The thinking that underpinned the project, as I said, the agency has moved on in its own thinking as well to a much broader definition of inclusion. And although in this project the focus was on young people with disabilities, we still hung on to our broader definition, so we were trying to sort of resolve some of those issues. We were looking at the need for system change, so we're moving from a deficit or maybe a medical model to a model that's more rights-based, looks at rights within education, particularly the right of the learner to participate and express their own views. To move from compensatory approaches, trying to put in something to make up for a deficit, to looking at how we can support individuals, how systems can be organised to strengthen all schools so they're much better at meeting a wider range of diverse needs. Looking at emphasis on preventing failure, so the earlier we can intervene and support young people, the better, so that they can develop resilience and become stronger and manage their own learning. And also following up the need for cooperation between agencies, between families, across all settings and services. The main products, outputs from the project, I mentioned the literature review. That is available on the European Agency website, only in English. The country reports and examples of practice are on the website, and there's also overviews of the provision and practice in each country, each of our agency member countries. There's reports from the 5 places that we visited, the 5 schools, materials from the seminars, and there will be, it's not there yet, but it will be a report, a final report, and that will be translated into Italian. And there's also going to be a practical tool to support decision makers. So a lot of the focus of the project was about how change can be managed in education. And so we're trying to do something more practical that will help ministries and leaders manage that change process. So just going to summarise some of the key findings from the 25 countries that took part in the project. We found, not surprisingly, that a lot of countries are undergoing change. I think over half countries had fairly major change in their legislation and policy in the last few years. When we looked at the legislation and the policy, some countries focus very much on the legal entitlement of learners to attend mainstream school, particularly in the context of the United Nations Convention. Some countries were more focused on parents' right to choose a school for their children. Other countries made reference to appropriate education, which is quite a subjective term, what is appropriate. And we spent quite some time discussing some of those ideas about whether the right to attend mainstream school is the right. Just putting children in mainstream school without quality support can be not very helpful. So we were discussing how to improve the quality of support for all learners. We looked at a lot of countries where there is still separate legislation for special educational needs, and talked about the need to try and have one legislative system, legal system, or law that covers all children, and that the need to use the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities as well as the rights of the child to emphasise the rights-based approach and make sure that children with disabilities needs are met within that. And as I said, a lot of countries are looking at moving towards early intervention, so there's an emphasis on picking up difficulties early on and intervening as soon as possible. One of the main project's themes was really about the role of special schools and special settings and how that's changing. In most countries, special schools are becoming resource centres. We had some examples of special schools that had actually changed to become mainstream schools. Certainly, in most countries, even if they're not changing their role, their special schools and settings are developing much closer links with mainstream schools and working within wider networks. And in some countries, special schools are becoming regional centres of expertise. And there's a strong feeling of the need to keep the expertise that exists currently in some of these special settings in a lot of countries. But there's a dilemma, particularly now when resources are short, trying to fund two systems of education, a special and mainstream system, is obviously increasingly difficult. And yet we've got special schools with a few low numbers, small number of children in, and that also becomes more difficult to provide a full curriculum, to provide peers to work with, and to really give a quality education in that setting. The ways countries are organising provision, teaching approaches, additional times, small group or individual work, the use of structuring learning. We looked quite carefully at learning support assistants and how they're used, and that's an issue in a lot of countries where resources are quite short, but the parents see having a one-to-one support assistant in the mainstream setting as a way to have their child in mainstream, but B, make sure that they have their entitlement. But sometimes those learning support assistants, maybe they're not used as effectively as they might be. We looked at some examples of co-teaching, particularly strong where mainstream subject teachers are working with specialist teachers, and I know Pam will say a bit more about that. And certainly the need for teamwork with other disciplines, so the more services can work together and work closely with families, the stronger, the better quality service. Obviously provision of agency services and multi-agency services, and the more closely they can work and build the capacity of those schools, then that's a stronger position for the school and the quality of learning for the young people. There's different funding models as we looked across the information from the countries, central funding and some countries providing additional funding for vulnerable learners. Again, as countries move to a wider definition, there's ways of funding different groups without trying to pinpoint particular or into particular needs. But increasingly, countries are moving to try and broaden out what is seen as support. It's seen as a continuum, then it follows that a certain number of hours of support could be given in the regular system before that child's even considered to have a special need or a label. So countries like Denmark, there's support going into the system as part of the regular system. On Saturday, for those of you who are still here, I'll talk a bit more about the conclusions and the final findings of the project. But for now, there is information on the website, and I know Claire will talk a bit more about some of the examples and some of the work we did. Thank you.